Ever wandered down a beach in Goa and noticed a few curious characters? A guy strumming an old guitar, someone playing a strange hand drum you've never seen before, a few sitting cross-legged in meditation, others just swaying to trance beats under the stars, maybe a little cloud of smoke floating around them. They're not just in Goa. You'll find them in Kathmandu, Bali, Amsterdam, London, little pockets of the same tribe scattered all over the world. Most people just call them hippies, sometimes dismissing them as broke, weed-smoking wanderers. But the truth is far more interesting. Hippies weren't just a bunch of drifters. They were part of a culture, a movement. For some, even a kind of spiritual path. So today on the Wisecrack Monk, we're digging into the real story, the birth, the rise, and the fall of the hippie culture, also known as counterculture, that changed the world. World War II and the birth of a new mindset. To understand the rise of the hippie movement, we need to rewind a couple of decades, back to a world on fire. World War II, from 1939 to 1945, was the deadliest conflict in human history. Entire cities turned to rubble. Over 70 million lives were lost. Families were torn apart. Soldiers returned broken in body and spirit. And the world that emerged after 1945 was scarred in ways that went far beyond the battlefields. For the youth growing up in the shadow of that war, the message was clear. The promises of the older generation, of progress, patriotism, and material success, had led straight to destruction. In the 1950s, the world entered the so-called golden age of consumerism. Shiny cars, neat suburban homes, televisions in every living room, symbols of a rebuilt economy. But for many young people, it felt hollow. They'd seen the cost of blind obedience, nationalism, and endless pursuit of wealth. Beneath the polished surface, there was a quiet rebellion brewing, a questioning of authority, a hunger for peace, meaning, and connection. By the early 1960s, the children of that post-war generation were ready to break free. They weren't interested in repeating their parents' mistakes. They were ready to reject the wars, the materialism, and the rigid rules of society that had failed them before. This is where the roots of the counterculture, the hippie movement, began to take shape. As a direct response to a world that had already shown them what hatred, greed, and war could do. Civil rights and peace movements, the spark before the hippies. As the world tried to heal from the scars of World War II, another battle was being fought, not overseas, but right at home. In the 1950s and early 60s, America was wrestling with its own conscience. Black men and women who had served and bled for their country during the war returned to find they were still denied the simplest human rights at home. From the bus boycotts in Montgomery to the brave young students who faced angry mobs just to enter a school, the civil rights movement became a fight not with weapons, but with marches, sit-ins, and words. And at the heart of it stood leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., preaching that real change could be won through non-violent resistance. For millions of young people watching, this was a revelation that you could stand up to injustice without picking up a gun. Meanwhile, across the ocean, new wars were brewing, most notably in Vietnam. Images of villages burning and body bags coming home began flooding television screens. The same generation that had cheered the civil rights marches now turned their voices toward peace. Campus by campus, city by city, they marched against the war. For the first time, a whole generation had tasted the power of mass protest. They realized they didn't have to silently accept the rules written by governments or traditions. This wave of activism, equal parts compassion and defiance, would become the heartbeat of the counterculture to come. Psychedelic research, the mind expansion. While the streets were filling with chants for peace and equality, something entirely different and far stranger was unfolding in quiet university labs. In the early 1960s, a psychology professor at Harvard University named Timothy Leary, along with colleague Richard Alpert, who the world would later know as Ram Dass, began studying a curious chemical, LSD. At first, it wasn't about parties or rebellion. The research asked a radical question for its time. Could certain psychedelic substances actually expand the human mind? Volunteers, students, writers, even clergy, described profound experiences, a sense of dissolving boundaries, feeling deeply connected to nature, to each other, and even to something bigger than themselves. Leary called it turning on the mind. He believed that by breaking the walls of ordinary perception, people could question everything: authority, war, greed, the meaning of life itself. But this idea, as you can imagine, didn't sit well with the establishment. By 1963, Harvard dismissed Leary and Alpert. That only made them louder. Leary famously urged the youth of America to turn on, tune in, drop out, a slogan that became the unofficial anthem of a generation ready to walk away from society's rules. Psychedelics quickly spilled out of the labs and into coffee houses, art studios, music festivals, and communes. What began as controlled research turned into a cultural revolution. For the emerging hippie movement, LSD and other psychedelics weren't just drugs. They were seen as tools for spiritual awakening and rebellion against a rigid, war-obsessed culture. In those shimmering colors and altered states, the youth found a kind of freedom their parents' material world could never offer. And that would change the face of the counterculture forever. Birth of hippie culture, 1960s. All these forces, the scars of war, the fight for civil rights, the call for peace, and the psychedelic search for a higher consciousness, began to converge. And from that collision of ideas, a brand new culture was born. By the mid-1960s, one neighborhood in San Francisco became its beating heart, Haight-Ashbury. What started as a cheap part of town for artists and students suddenly turned into a magnet for dreamers, musicians, drifters, and seekers from across America. They came for the music, for the promise of freedom, and for the hope of building a world that wasn't built on war or money. These were the first people to proudly call themselves hippies. Their beliefs and ideals were simple but radical for the time. Peace over war, a refusal to be drafted into conflicts they didn't believe in. Love over materialism, choosing community, art, and compassion instead of chasing careers and cars. A return to nature and simplicity, organic food, communal living, even vegetarianism long before it was fashionable. A fascination with Eastern spirituality, meditation, yoga, and mysticism became their tools for exploring the inner world. Their symbols soon became unmistakable: tie-dye shirts, beads, flowing skirts, long hair, bare feet. Psychedelic rock music became their voice. Bands like the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, and later the legendary Woodstock Festival of 1969. And of course, the peace sign, drawn on banners, jackets, and walls, became the universal emblem of their rebellion. To outsiders, they looked like a ragtag group of drifters camping out in parks. But to themselves, they were pioneers of a different way of living. One where kindness mattered more than status, where art mattered more than money, and where questioning authority was almost a sacred duty. This was the birth of hippie culture, a movement that promised to reshape not just music or fashion, but the very soul of a generation. The Vietnam War and the hippie revolt. While the streets of San Francisco were pulsing with music and peace signs, on the other side of the world, a much darker storm was brewing: the Vietnam War. It began as a conflict between communist-led North Vietnam and the US-backed South Vietnam in the late 1950s. By the mid-60s, the United States had plunged deep into the fighting, sending hundreds of thousands of young soldiers, many barely out of high school, to the jungles of Southeast Asia. For the first time in history, a war wasn't just something you read about in newspapers. It came straight into American living rooms, filmed by television crews, shown almost nightly on the evening news. Viewers saw burning villages, helicopters dropping napalm, and the bodies of both soldiers and civilians. The glossy speeches of politicians couldn't hide what people were watching with their own eyes. The country that had fought Hitler to defend freedom now seemed trapped in a bloody conflict far from home, and no one could clearly explain why. Back home, the youth who were already questioning authority felt betrayed. The same generation preaching peace and love in the parks of Haight-Ashbury began to march in the streets, demanding an end to the war. The hippies became the face of the anti-war movement. They staged be-ins and love-ins, peaceful gatherings where music and protest fused into one. They carried placards with the now-famous slogan, "Make love, not war." Many refused the draft entirely, burning their draft cards in public, a bold act of defiance that often landed them in jail. Their protests weren't just political statements. They were cultural performances, filled with flowers, guitars, and chants of peace that stood in stark contrast to the violence on TV screens. By the late 1960s, these anti-war demonstrations grew into some of the largest protests in U.S. history, eventually helping to turn public opinion against the conflict. The Vietnam War not only scarred two nations, it also defined a generation's mistrust of government and deepened the hippies' commitment to peace over power. Golden Era, Summer of Love and Global Spread. By 1967, the counterculture was ready to explode. San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district had become a magnet for dreamers, artists, and rebels from across the country. They called themselves hippies, but they were more than just a name. They were a movement, a lifestyle, a rebellion wrapped in love beads, bell-bottoms, and tie-dye. That year, the city witnessed the legendary Summer of Love. Over 100,000 young people flocked to the streets, parks, and coffeehouses, bringing music, psychedelic art, and a contagious idealism. For a few magical months, it seemed possible that peace, love, and freedom could actually take over the world. Music became the heartbeat of the movement. Bands like the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, and Jimi Hendrix weren't just performing. They were giving voice to a generation questioning authority, war, and conformity. But Haight-Ashbury wasn't the only place feeling the wave. Hippie culture spilled across the globe. London and Amsterdam saw youth embracing psychedelia and anti-establishment ideals. Paris echoed with student protests and experimental communes. Kathmandu became the ultimate spiritual and psychedelic destination for overland travelers. Goa offered beaches, music, and the freedom to explore life outside the rules of mainstream society. Even Bali, Sydney, and parts of Canada began hosting alternative communities, creating a worldwide network of countercultural hubs. The Hippie Trail, that iconic overland route from Europe to South Asia, carried thousands of young seekers. Guitars slung over their backs, backpacks filled with dreams, and hearts open to everything the world had to offer. This was the golden era of hippie culture, a time when rebellion met celebration, spirituality met freedom, and young people dared to imagine a different world, one that questioned war, materialism, and authority at every turn. Everywhere they went, they left a mark, in music, fashion, philosophy, and the very idea that life could be lived differently. The Hippie Trail and life on the Magic Bus. While music festivals and love-ins were taking over cities, another adventure was quietly reshaping the hippie movement, the Hippie Trail. This wasn't just a trip, it was a journey of discovery, freedom, and rebellion, stretching from London and Amsterdam all the way to Kathmandu, India. Along the way, travelers experienced different cultures, philosophies, and ways of life, and carried the hippie ideals wherever they went. At the heart of the trail was the legendary Magic Bus. Old, rattling, sometimes falling apart buses became mobile communes. Packed with strangers who quickly became friends, they traveled weeks, even months across Europe, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and finally into South Asia. Life on the Magic Bus was anything but comfortable. Hard seats, dusty roads, and frequent breakdowns. Simple meals cooked over roadside fires or in tiny inns. Nights spent in tents, roadside fields, or even sleeping on the bus itself. And yet, it was magical. Anne Gordon, a British traveler in 1968, recalled, "It was slow, dusty, often broke down, but it was the cheapest ticket to freedom. By the time we reached Kabul, we were a family." Nick Laird-Clowes, a musician traveling in 1970, said, "The bus would stop in little villages, and people would stare at us like we'd come from another planet. Long hair, beads, guitars. We were spreading the 60s wherever we went. Passengers sang, played instruments, smoked hashish, and shared stories." The bus became a floating community, a rolling expression of hippie ideals, peace, love, and curiosity. At the trail's end, cities like Kathmandu and Goa became epicenters for backpackers, spiritual seekers, and psychedelic explorers. Freak Street in Kathmandu was filled with guest houses, yoga classes, and hashish cafes. Goa's beaches pulsed with music, meditation circles, and the energy of a world unshackled from convention. The Hippie Trail and Magic Bus journeys didn't just transport people geographically. They transported a culture, a mindset, a way of living that would leave an indelible mark on the world. The decline of the Hippie Trail and movement. For a while, it felt like freedom had won. Roads stretched endlessly, beaches were alive with music, and cities like San Francisco, Goa, and Kathmandu seemed to exist in a world outside time, a world shaped by peace, love, and exploration. But as with most things that burn bright, the flame eventually flickered. By the late 1970s, the hippie trail was closing. Political upheavals in Iran and Afghanistan made overland travel dangerous or impossible. Borders tightened. Roads that once welcomed dreamers became barriers. The magic buses rattled less and eventually stopped rolling. And it wasn't just geopolitics. The ideals of the movement itself began to erode under the weight of consumerism and mainstream society. Hippie fashion, tie-dye, beads, bell-bottoms, was sold in stores. The culture that had rejected materialism became a marketable brand. Music, once a vehicle for revolution, was now commercialized. Drugs, once a tool for spiritual exploration, began to take a darker turn. Weed and LSD, used for expanding consciousness, were increasingly overshadowed by heroin, meth, and harder narcotics. Addiction, crime, and tragedy started to replace the original idealism of the psychedelic experience. The dream of a world built on love, music, and communal freedom began to collide with real-world pressures: money, work, and societal norms. The generation that had once traveled continents to drop out slowly found themselves pulled back in, trying to survive, to earn, to conform. Yet even as the trail closed and cities returned to their regular rhythms, the ideas lived on. Hippie ideals didn't vanish entirely. They simply evolved, morphing into environmental activism, yoga and meditation culture, modern music festivals, and the global backpacker movement. The moment of absolute freedom, the rolling waves of rebellion, and the euphoria of living outside the system didn't last long enough to change the world entirely. But it left behind a legacy, a reminder that questioning authority, valuing experience over wealth, and seeking connection over consumption could shape generations in ways no law or market could erase. Legacy and surviving hippie culture. The golden era may have faded, and the magic buses may have stopped rolling, but the spirit of the hippies didn't disappear. Today, pockets of that countercultural energy still thrive, a reminder that ideals don't die, they evolve. Goa, India remains a mecca for travelers seeking freedom, music, and spiritual exploration. Beaches still hum with guitars, drum circles, and trance parties, echoing the days of the hippie trail. Kathmandu, once famous for Freak Street, continues to welcome backpackers and spiritual seekers who explore yoga, meditation, and local culture, carrying forward the curiosity and openness of generations past. Bali, Ubud, and parts of Thailand host communities devoted to wellness, art, and alternative lifestyles. The same energy that fueled the original hippies now inspires eco-villages, retreat centers, and conscious travel. Music festivals worldwide, from Burning Man in Nevada to Boom Festival in Portugal, are spiritual descendants of Woodstock, a place where art, music, and community merge, celebrating freedom and expression. And even though consumerism and mainstream culture are dominant, the values of the movement live on. Questioning authority, seeking experiences over possessions, prioritizing peace, love, and connection, exploring the mind, spirit, and world with curiosity. The hippie movement may have been brief, a decade-long flame in history, but its echoes can still be felt in the music we listen to, the travels we take, the communities we build, and the ways we dream of a freer, kinder world. In the end, hippies weren't just a group of drifters or rebels. They were the vanguard of an idea that life could be lived differently, and that even small acts of rebellion, love, and curiosity could ripple across generations. And that's a wrap on our journey through the rise, rebellion, and legacy of hippie culture. Thanks for hanging out with the Wisecrack Monk today. If you enjoyed this trip through history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more curious stories, and share it with your friends who love a little truth, history, and a dash of chaos. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the weirdest paths lead to the most interesting places.